Carmen Rodriguez, a 34-year-old bilingual elementary school teacher and mother of 2 young children, thought her biggest challenge was helping her third graders navigate reading comprehension. Then Vernon Blackstone knocked on her door at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, demanding she remove her non-compliant foreign language signage immediately. What unfolded over the next 8 months would test everything she believed about home, belonging, and the true meaning of community in America. Before this story begins, consider how many of your own neighborhood traditions might be seen as violations by someone determined to find fault. This happened just 18 months ago in a planned community outside Phoenix, Arizona. The family still lives there today, and their doormat still says exactly what it always has. Carmen had saved for 7 years to buy the modest 3-bedroom house on Saguaro Lane. Every morning she stepped over the cheerful woven mat that read, "Bienvenidos" in flowing script letters as she left for Jefferson Elementary, where she taught bilingual education to children whose families, like hers, were building new American dreams. The mat had been a housewarming gift from her mother, who had crossed the border 40 years earlier with nothing but determination and a fierce belief that education would open every door for her children. David Rodriguez worked construction, leaving before dawn most mornings to frame houses across the rapidly growing suburbs. Their daughter Sophia was 8, full of questions about everything from why clouds moved, to why some grown-ups seemed angry when they heard Spanish spoken in the grocery store. Their son Miguel, 12 and already showing his father's practical intelligence, had just made the school soccer team and spent evenings practicing footwork in their small backyard. The Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association had seemed welcoming enough when Carmen and David first moved in 3 years earlier. The community featured neat rows of stucco houses painted in approved desert tones, with shared walking paths and a small playground, where Sophia had quickly made friends with other children from the diverse families drawn to the affordable neighborhood. Carmen had even volunteered to translate HOA documents into Spanish for the growing number of Latino families, an offer that had been politely declined by the board. Vernon Blackstone had lived in Willowbrook Estates since its construction in 1994, watching as the original residents, mostly white retirees and young professional couples, gradually gave way to families with different surnames, different languages, and different holiday decorations. As compliance chairman for the HOA board, Vernon took pride in maintaining what he called community standards, conducting weekly walks through the neighborhood with a clipboard and measuring tape, documenting violations from grass height to mailbox positioning. The trouble began on an ordinary Monday morning, when Carmen received her first official notice. The form letter, typed on HOA letterhead, cited violation of Section 12.3.4. All exterior signage must be in English and conform to approved design standards. The fine $50 per day until compliance was achieved. Carmen read the letter 3 times, genuinely confused about what signage they were referencing. Their house number was clearly displayed in regulation numerals. They had no political signs, no commercial advertisements, no unauthorized decorations. It wasn't until Vernon appeared at her door the following morning, clipboard in hand and his silver Buick parked in her driveway, that Carmen understood. He pointed directly at her doormat, explaining in the tone of someone addressing a particularly slow child that foreign language displays were prohibited under the signage ordinance. Carmen's initial response was polite confusion. She explained that bienvenidos simply meant welcome, hardly controversial messaging for a doormat. Vernon's response revealed the true nature of his concern. If they allowed Spanish on doormats, what would stop people from putting up signs in Arabic, Chinese, or who knows what other languages? Carmen's first instinct was accommodation. She had spent her career navigating between cultures, translating not just words but entire ways of understanding the world. If changing a doormat would preserve peace in her community, perhaps it was a small price to pay. She visited 3 different stores that evening, searching for an appropriate replacement. But as she stood in the home goods aisle, holding a plain mat that simply read "Welcome," something in her chest tightened. This wasn't just about a doormat anymore. The daily $50 fines began accumulating immediately. Vernon's interpretation of the HOA covenant was inflexible. Each day, the non-compliant signage remained constituted a separate violation. Carmen requested a hearing before the HOA board, hoping reasonable discussion might resolve what seemed like an obvious misunderstanding. The hearing, held in the community clubhouse on a Thursday evening, revealed the depth of division lurking beneath Willowbrook's placid surface. Board President Margaret Thornton, a retired bank manager who had served in the role for 6 years, seemed genuinely uncomfortable with the situation. She acknowledged that no previous resident had ever been cited for doormat language, and that similar mats in French or Italian had never generated complaints. However, she explained, the board had received multiple resident concerns about the Spanish mat specifically. When Carmen asked to know who had complained and what their specific objections were, she was told this information was confidential to protect community harmony. The hearing lasted 47 minutes. Carmen presented her case methodically, noting that bienvenidos was a single word expressing universal hospitality, that it posed no safety concerns, and that it violated no reasonable interpretation of community aesthetic standards. She brought examples of other decorative items throughout the neighborhood that contained text, garden signs reading "Bloom where you're planted," autumn flags with "Give thanks" messaging, even a doormat 2 streets over that proclaimed the Smiths in elaborate cursive script. Vernon's counter-argument focused on precedent and slippery slopes. He argued that allowing non-English text would open the door to unlimited foreign language displays that could eventually make the community unrecognizable to long-term residents. He cited property values, community cohesion, and the importance of maintaining the character that had attracted residents to Willowbrook in the first place. His voice carried the weight of someone who saw himself as defending civilization itself. The board's decision was unanimous, the violation stood, and daily fines would continue until compliance was achieved. Carmen left the meeting with a sinking realization that this conflict was never really about doormats or signage ordinances. It was about who belonged in Willowbrook Estates and who got to decide. The financial pressure mounted quickly. $50 per day translated to $1,500 per month, nearly a third of Carmen's teaching salary. David worked overtime when he could get it, but construction work was seasonal and unpredictable. They had already dipped into their modest emergency fund to cover Miguel's soccer equipment and Sophia's upcoming school field trip. The HOA fines represented money they simply didn't have, threatening the very stability they had worked so hard to achieve. Sophia began asking questions Carmen struggled to answer. Why were some neighbors no longer waving when they passed on the street? Why did Mrs. Patterson, who used to compliment Sophia's drawings, now hurry inside when they approached? Why did the man with the clipboard keep taking pictures of their front door? Carmen found herself explaining concepts of prejudice and fairness to an 8-year-old, who had never before questioned her right to exist peacefully in her own neighborhood. The stress began affecting every aspect of their family life. Carmen had trouble sleeping, lying awake calculating how long they could sustain the daily fines before facing serious financial consequences. David's anger simmered just below the surface as he watched his wife, a woman who dedicated her life to helping children, succeed, being systematically harassed for displaying a word that meant welcome in her mother's language. Miguel's grades slipped as playground conflicts emerged between children, whose parents had chosen sides in the adult drama unfolding around them. 3 months into the conflict, Carmen made a discovery that changed everything. While researching HOA law at the public library, she stumbled across Arizona's Fair Housing Act protections and federal civil rights statutes that specifically prohibited housing discrimination based on national origin. The language of these laws was clear: HOA enforcement that disproportionately targeted residents based on their ethnicity or cultural expression could constitute illegal discrimination, regardless of whether the rules themselves appeared neutral. Carmen's research revealed a disturbing pattern in Vernon's enforcement history. Over the past 2 years, Spanish-speaking families had received violations at nearly 3 times the rate of other residents. Citations for excessive noise during quinceañera celebrations, unauthorized gatherings for backyard baptism parties, and landscaping violations for vegetable gardens that reflected traditional Mexican agricultural practices. Vernon's documentation was meticulous, but the targeting was unmistakable. Armed with this evidence, Carmen contacted the Arizona Civil Liberties Union. Attorney Maria Santos, a specialist in housing discrimination cases, immediately recognized the systemic nature of Vernon's enforcement pattern. She explained to Carmen that individual bias often hides behind seemingly neutral rules, and that civil rights law existed precisely to challenge this kind of discriminatory application of authority. The decision to file a federal lawsuit wasn't easy. Carmen had never imagined herself as someone who would sue her own community. She had moved to Willowbrook seeking the peaceful suburban life she had dreamed of as a child, watching her mother clean other people's houses after finishing her factory shift. But the daily fines had now exceeded $4,000, and the harassment was affecting her children's well-being and her own ability to function as an educator. The lawsuit filing sent shockwaves through Willowbrook Estates. Some neighbors rallied to Carmen's defense, organizing a petition supporting her right to cultural expression and condemning what they saw as obvious discrimination. Others doubled down on supporting the HOA's authority, arguing that rules were rules and that exceptions would lead to chaos. The community that had once felt unified around shared suburban aspirations now found itself divided along lines that many residents had preferred to ignore. Dorothy Chen, an 84-year-old widow who had lived quietly on Carmen Street for 15 years, emerged as an unexpected ally. Dorothy had immigrated from Taiwan as a young bride in 1962, and she remembered the subtle and not-so-subtle ways communities could make families feel unwelcome. She began making daily walks past Carmen's house, always pausing to admire the Bienvenidos mat and speak loudly enough for Vernon to hear about how welcoming messages made neighborhoods feel friendly and safe. Vernon's response to the lawsuit was swift and defensive. He hired his own attorney and countersued Carmen for harassment and disruption of community harmony. His legal filing painted him as a dedicated volunteer trying to maintain property values against residents who refused to follow established rules. He denied any discriminatory intent, arguing that he would cite any resident who violated signage ordinances, regardless of their background. The depositions revealed the true scope of Vernon's surveillance activities. His basement office contained detailed files on every Spanish-speaking family in Willowbrook, complete with photographs, violation histories, and personal notes about their activities. He had documented children's birthday parties as noise violations, recorded license plates of visitors to track excessive gatherings, and maintained a calendar marking cultural holidays as potential disruption events. Carmen's deposition lasted 6 hours. She testified about the fear her children experienced walking to the school bus, the financial stress threatening their family's stability, and the profound sadness of watching her dream neighborhood transform into a place where she felt surveilled and unwelcome. Her voice remained steady as she explained that keeping her mother's gift wasn't about defiance. It was about maintaining her dignity as an American who happened to speak 2 languages. The case attracted media attention throughout Arizona. Carmen found herself featured in newspaper articles and television news segments, representing broader questions about immigration, cultural assimilation, and the boundaries of community authority. She received supportive messages from across the country but also hateful emails questioning her right to live in America at all. The personal attacks were particularly painful for someone who dedicated her career to helping American children succeed in school. Months of legal proceedings took their toll on everyone involved. Vernon's wife Margaret began expressing private concerns about the direction their community was heading, worried that their neighborhood was becoming known for discrimination rather than family friendliness. Several HOA board members quietly questioned whether the doormat controversy was worth the mounting legal costs and negative publicity threatening property values throughout Willowbrook. The breakthrough came during Vernon's second deposition, when Maria Santos presented him with side-by-side photographs of violations in the community. 2 doormats, both featuring decorative text, both technically violating the same signage ordinance. One read "The Johnson Family St. 1987" in elaborate script lettering. The other was Carmen's Bienvenidos mat. When asked why the Johnson mat had never generated a violation despite being reported by residents, Vernon's explanation revealed the discriminatory nature of his enforcement. He claimed the English text served an informational purpose while the Spanish text was merely decorative. Maria Santos's questioning became more pointed. She presented evidence of Vernon's selective enforcement, his detailed surveillance of Latino families, and his own statements about preventing foreign influence in the community. Vernon's attorney attempted damage control, but the pattern was undeniable. This wasn't about consistent rule enforcement, it was about using HOA authority to target families Vernon found personally objectionable. The turning point came when Sofia Rodriguez testified via video deposition, supervised by a court-appointed child advocate. In her 8-year-old voice, Sofia explained that Bienvenidos was the first Spanish word she had learned to read, and that seeing it every day reminded her of her grandmother's love. She described feeling scared when the man with the clipboard took pictures of her family's house, and asked the judge whether speaking Spanish at home meant they didn't belong in America. Vernon watched Sofia's testimony from his attorney's office, and something fundamental shifted in his expression. For the first time, he seemed to see the human cost of his crusade beyond his abstract concerns about community standards and property values. His wife Margaret, who had supported his HOA involvement for years, quietly asked him whether this was really the legacy he wanted to leave in their community. The federal judge assigned to the case, the Honorable Patricia Flores, had herself grown up in a bilingual household and understood the broader civil rights implications of seemingly minor discrimination. During preliminary hearings, she made it clear that HOA authority was not unlimited, and that civil rights law protected residents from enforcement that targeted their cultural expression or national origin. As the case moved toward trial, pressure mounted on both sides to reach a settlement. Carmen's legal costs were being covered by the ACLU, but the emotional toll on her family was enormous. Vernon faced the possibility of significant financial damages and the likelihood that his discriminatory enforcement pattern would be exposed in open court. The HOA board, recognizing that their insurance might not cover discrimination lawsuits, began pressuring Vernon to find a resolution. The mediation session lasted 8 hours. Carmen and Vernon sat across a conference table for the first time since that early morning confrontation, over her doormat, each accompanied by their attorneys and facing the human cost of their conflict. Maria Santos presented a clear case for systematic discrimination, while Vernon's lawyer attempted to frame the dispute as a simple contract enforcement matter. The mediator, a retired federal magistrate with experience in civil rights cases, helped both parties understand the broader implications of their dispute. She explained to Vernon that his enforcement pattern, regardless of his stated intentions, had created a discriminatory impact that violated federal housing law. She helped Carmen understand that resolution might require compromise, but that her willingness to fight had already protected future families from similar targeting. The settlement agreement reached that day was more comprehensive than either side had initially imagined. Vernon agreed to remove all fines against Carmen's family and to resign from his position as compliance chairman. The HOA board committed to revising their signage ordinance to explicitly protect cultural expression and to providing anti-discrimination training for all board members and committee chairs. Carmen agreed to drop her lawsuit and to work with the board on developing more inclusive community policies, but the most meaningful moment came when Vernon, without prompting from his attorney, addressed Carmen directly. He acknowledged that his enforcement had targeted her family unfairly, and that his fear of demographic change had led him to use his HOA position in ways that hurt his neighbors. He didn't excuse his behavior, but he expressed genuine remorse for the stress he had caused Sophia and Miguel, who had never asked to be caught in an adult conflict over cultural belonging. Carmen's response surprised everyone in the room. Rather than expressing anger or demanding additional penalties, she invited Vernon to visit her classroom to see how bilingual education actually worked. She explained that her students, children from many different backgrounds, learned that speaking multiple languages was a strength, not a threat to American identity. Vernon, perhaps for the first time, began to understand that his neighbors' cultural expressions were not attacks on his way of life, but rather additions to the community's richness. The implementation of the settlement agreement transformed Willowbrook Estates in ways that went beyond legal compliance. The new signage ordinance explicitly protected cultural expressions of welcome, celebration, and family identity while maintaining reasonable restrictions on commercial advertising and political displays. The anti-discrimination training, conducted by the Arizona Civil Rights Division, helped board members understand how unconscious bias could influence community governance. Vernon's resignation created an opening for fresh leadership on the HOA board. Dorothy Chen, despite her age, agreed to serve as interim compliance chair, bringing her decades of community experience and her commitment to fair treatment for all residents. Her first official act was to commend Carmen for her courage in standing up for civil rights, noting that such stands often protected entire communities from discriminatory practices. The financial impact of the settlement was significant but manageable for the HOA. The legal costs and policy changes were expensive, but they prevented the far greater costs that would have resulted from a discrimination judgment. More importantly, property values in Willowbrook actually increased following the resolution, as the community's reputation shifted from a place known for ethnic targeting to one celebrated for inclusive leadership. Carmen's victory resonated throughout Arizona's Latino communities. She began speaking at community meetings and civil rights conferences, sharing her experience and encouraging other families facing similar discrimination to know their rights. Her message was always balanced. She loved her community and never wanted to be a symbol of conflict, but she refused to accept that cultural expression was incompatible with American neighborhood life. The changes in Carmen's own family were equally profound. Sophia, who had spent months feeling anxious about her identity and place in the community, began bringing friends home who wanted to learn Spanish phrases from the welcoming mat. Miguel's confidence returned as playground tensions eased and his soccer teammates. Families began attending games regardless of their backgrounds or languages. David's anger transformed into pride as he watched his wife become a community leader without losing her essential kindness. Vernon's transformation was perhaps the most unexpected outcome of the entire conflict. His conversations with Carmen led to genuine self-reflection about his assumptions and fears. He began volunteering at Jefferson Elementary, helping with after-school tutoring programs, where he discovered that bilingual children were often the most eager students. His relationship with his wife improved as she expressed pride in his willingness to admit mistakes and grow from them. The broader impact on Willowbrook Estates created a new model for HOA governance. The board established a community relations committee focused on celebrating the neighborhood's diversity rather than suppressing it. They organized cultural festivals where families shared foods, traditions, and stories from their various backgrounds. The playground that had once been divided by playground politics became a place where children learned phrases in multiple languages while their parents built genuine friendships. 1 year after the settlement, Carmen's Bienvenidos mat remained in place, now joined by similar cultural expressions throughout the community. The Patel family displayed a Sanskrit blessing on their doorstep. The O'Brien family hung an Irish Gaelic welcome sign. The Kim family's mat featured both English and Korean characters. Vernon, in a gesture that surprised no one more than himself, placed a small sign in his garden reading "All are welcome here" in both English and Spanish. The true measure of change came during Willowbrook's annual community picnic. Families that had been divided during the doormat controversy now shared tables, traded recipes, and watched their children play together without the undercurrent of tension that had poisoned previous gatherings. Carmen found herself serving on the planning committee alongside Dorothy Chen and, remarkably, Margaret Blackstone, Vernon's wife, who had become an advocate for inclusive community policies. Carmen's mother, visiting from Tucson for the celebration, walked through Willowbrook's winding streets with tears in her eyes. She told Carmen that seeing her daughter's courage had reminded her of her own journey to America decades earlier, and that the community Carmen had created through her stand was exactly the kind of place she had dreamed her children might someday call home. The Bienvenidos mat, she noted, had done exactly what it was supposed to do. It had welcomed everyone. The legal precedent established by Carmen's case influenced HOA governance throughout Arizona and beyond. Civil rights attorneys began citing the Willowbrook settlement in cases involving cultural discrimination, while HOA management companies developed new training programs to help community leaders understand the boundaries of their authority. Carmen's story became a teaching case in law schools and public administration programs, illustrating how individual courage could create systemic change. But for Carmen Rodriguez, the deepest satisfaction came from much simpler victories. Sophia's confidence had fully returned, and she now proudly served as a translator for Spanish-speaking families new to the neighborhood. Miguel's soccer team had become truly integrated, with parents from various backgrounds forming carpools and creating lifelong friendships. David's construction crew, learning about his wife's advocacy, began calling him El Defensor, the Defender, a title he wore with quiet pride. Vernon Blackstone, now retired from HOA governance but more engaged with his community than ever before, often stopped by Carmen's classroom to help with reading programs. His relationship with the Rodriguez family had evolved from antagonism through legal conflict to something resembling friendship. He never fully understood why his early fears had led him to see threat where others saw welcome, but he had learned that communities grew stronger when they embraced rather than suppressed their residents' diverse identities. The Bienvenidos mat, weathered now from daily use in Arizona sunshine, continued to greet visitors to the Rodriguez home, but its meaning had expanded far beyond its simple message. It had become a symbol of the possibility that communities could face their prejudices honestly, that neighbors could choose growth over fear, and that standing up for dignity, even over something as small as a doormat, could transform entire neighborhoods. Carmen still taught bilingual education at Jefferson Elementary, but her classroom had become a destination for educators studying inclusive practices. She had received teaching awards and speaking invitations, but she remained focused on the daily work of helping children navigate between languages and cultures. Her students, many of whom lived in Willowbrook, grew up understanding that their multilingual abilities were assets to be celebrated rather than differences to be hidden. As sunset approached over Willowbrook Estates each evening, children from various backgrounds played together in yards where cultural expressions bloomed like desert flowers after rain. The community that had once threatened to tear itself apart over a single Spanish word had discovered that diversity, when embraced with courage and goodwill, created the very harmony its residents had always sought. The doormat still said bienvenidos, and everyone was welcome. If this situation unfolded in your neighborhood, would you find the courage to stand up like Carmen did? Sometimes protecting what matters most requires us to discover strength we never knew we had. Carmen Rodriguez never wanted to become a civil rights advocate, she simply wanted to maintain her dignity while raising her children in a community where they belonged. Her 8-month battle over a doormat reminds us that the freedoms we value most are often protected not by grand gestures, but by ordinary people who refuse to accept that their cultural identity is incompatible with American neighborhood life. The next time you see something that seems different in your community, ask yourself, am I seeing a threat to be eliminated, or a gift to be welcomed?